I was ready for work and sat down to breakfast with coffee and the morning paper while Janet was still dressing in the bedroom. This morning was like any other working day of the past year. As I skimmed the first page, there it was, right in the middle, just as Carmine had predicted last night. Carmine always keeps his promises. The news reported on a man found hanged in his garage. Robert Tolson, an employee of Calcus Realty, was found dead, beaten, and then strangled. Janet also works for Calcus Realty. At the moment, the police do not have any suspects, and the investigation is just beginning. There was no need to read further. I folded the paper and put it on the table where Janet always sits. A warm, comforting feeling washed over me as I reflected on the events leading up to that morning. Sipping my coffee, I watched as Janet entered the breakfast area. She was beautiful. Today, my wife of 5 years looks even more gorgeous than she did 7 years ago when we first met. No greetings were exchanged as she poured herself a cup of coffee. It's hard to believe how much our marriage has shrunk over the past year. Our eyes met briefly and I smiled slightly, acknowledging her arrival. She didn't say anything to me, continuing a pattern that had been going on for the past 2 months after our major argument about her extended work hours. She seemed withdrawn, displaying a coldness that contrasted sharply with her warmth during our courtship. I really missed that closeness. Now it seemed that everything would end. Janet had a newspaper in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Her eyes scanned the headlines and suddenly spat out her coffee, staring at an article about the murder of Robert Tolson. "Oh God, no!" she screamed, looking like she was about to puke as she rushed to the bathroom. I sat in silence, knowing that I had nothing to say to her on the subject. Taking a deep breath, I stood up, put a cup of coffee in the dishwasher, and grabbed my briefcase. I went out to the garage and got into my car, not bothering to check on Janet. It didn't matter to me how she felt. Now let me introduce myself. My name is John Canello, but my friends call me JC. I'm 29 years old, Sicilian, living in the Italian part of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My youth was spent mostly in trouble with a group of young Italian boys. We imagined ourselves as a junior mafia. I'll skip most of the other mishaps we've had and focus on one event that changed my direction significantly. Carmine Vitalio and I were closer than two brothers. We were the same age and hung out with the same group of guys. The main difference between me and Carmine was the power of the mind. I'm not going to say that Carmine was unintelligent or anything. It's just that he couldn't seem to stay out of trouble with the law. Despite our common crimes, he was the one who was usually caught by the police. One night, Carmine and I broke into a warehouse near the wharf, hoping to steal something for a quick buck. The security guards must have noticed us coming in through the side window because they waited while we tried to leave with a few boxes of MP3 players. One guard grabbed Carmine as I turned around and another tried to grab me. I shoved the box in his face and then jumped onto another guard's back, hitting him on the side of the head with all my might. When he freed Carmine, I tackled him to the ground, urging him to run as fast as he could. Carmine ran away, leaving me behind. The other guard recovered and grabbed me from behind, and there wasn't much of a struggle after that. The guards beat me until the police arrived. When they appeared, they were laughing along with the guards as they examined my bruised and bloody body. They took me to the police station and kept me in a cell until my parents came to release me. Long story short, I never revealed the identity of my accomplice in the warehouse. I got 2 weeks in jail and probation. Carmine called me several times to apologize for leaving me, but I reassured him that it was okay, given that his previous record could have sent him to prison for much longer. He vowed to make it up to me, no matter how long it took. My parents were furious and embarrassed by my arrest. My dad used to punish me with his leather belt until I almost bled, and then they decided to enroll me in St. Peter's Catholic High School to get better. Needless to say, the nuns and priests did an excellent job of disciplining me. In my senior year, I changed my lifestyle. One of the priests who mentored me encouraged me to take a different path, so I left the neighborhood gang and eventually did well enough to be accepted back into Penn State. Long story short, I did well in college and graduated with a degree in HR. Finding a job in a reputable company after graduation was easy. This time my parents were proud of me. Although I dated a lot of women in college, I wasn't ready for a serious commitment. It wasn't until 3 years after graduation that I met Janet Ficanio, who made me rethink my single life. We met at a seminar for HR representatives. Afterwards, I got her phone number and promised to call her, which she seemed to like. Janet was unlike any other woman I had ever met and had a multifaceted personality. Sometimes she reminded me of Chris Costner's character in The Three Faces of Eve. The trait I least admired about Janet was her stubbornness. Once she made up her mind on an issue, nothing could dissuade her from her belief, no matter how wrong it might be. Our dating experience was characterized by periods of closeness followed by distance. We refrained from participating in bodily activities. During the first year of our relationship, I learned about Janet's childhood abandonment. Her mother abandoned her in a church pew and walked out of her life, leading to her being raised in orphanages and foster homes. I firmly believe that the lack of maternal love and care during her formative years contributed significantly to Janet's personality difficulties. Despite her struggles, Janet remained the kindest and warmest person I have ever known. In the early years of our life together, my parents did not support my relationship with Janet. Throughout our courtship, they warned me not to get too attached to her, but I didn't heed their advice. Janet and I exchanged vows in a low-key ceremony at our local church. We both agreed to delay starting a family until we were financially stable, and Janet could become a full-time mother, a decision my parents did not approve of. Problems arose in our third year of marriage when Janet's company was acquired by a larger corporation, causing her to lose her job. She struggled with depression over the loss of a job she valued. Although we weren't struggling financially, it took Janet a few months to find a new job that she wasn't thrilled about, an office manager position at Calcas Real Estate. I made an effort to support Janet during her unemployment, but sometimes I felt she resented my full-time job while she accepted less. She experienced significant mood swings, especially during her monthly cycle. After a few months in Calcasa, she gradually resumed her usual pleasant demeanor. Our situation has improved, including our bed life, which suffered during her unemployment. There were moments in our bedroom when I felt that Janet was trying her best to make up for the adversity by being more assertive in our lovemaking activities. For about 9 months, I didn't complain and our family life was thriving. Janet became more enthusiastic about her work and even took a real estate home study course. I was pleased with her transformation and the loving wife she was to me. Then, amid difficult circumstances, came both good and bad news. The good news was my steady progress up the management ladder in my company. After 5 years with them, my future looked promising. However, the merger with an Atlanta-based company has resulted in significant changes to my duties. Atlanta was to be integrated into our corporate structure, giving me responsibility for training their staff and necessary downsizing. I was excited about the new challenges, but the downside was that I would be traveling more and for longer periods away from home. Janet was not happy about the prospect of my increasing time on the road, even though I made an effort to be home on weekends during long trips. At first, Janet's anger at my frequent absences seemed to subside, but, as so often happens, complications arose. Gradually, my coming home on weekends was not enough to make up for my extended time away. Janet stuck to her stubborn mindset, accusing me of enjoying my absence and even hinting that I might have a lover in Atlanta. Despite my best efforts, including calling her during the day, sending flowers and humorous cards, her distance remained. Staff training in Atlanta took nearly 6 months to complete, marking the end of my travels. In addition, I received a promotion at corporate headquarters, expecting that these changes would improve Janet's perception of me. However, it turned out that I was wrong. Once I stopped traveling, Janet increased her workload at the agency. When I asked her about it, she sarcastically pointed out that it was her turn to work for a promotion and told me it was time for me to be alone in the evenings. Our closeness suffered. 2 weeks ago, Janet informed me that she and her colleagues would be away for the weekend to attend a session on high-rise condominium developers near the riverfront. She deemed it necessary for her career development without consulting me about her absence, leaving no room for discussion. Even though I stopped running with the junior mafia back in high school, I remained close with some of my best friends, especially Carmine. I called him and asked if he wanted to watch the Steelers versus Raiders game on Sunday. Without thinking twice, he agreed, knowing how to score the best tickets to Steelers games. I mentioned Janet's business trip, so Carmine suggested I spend the weekend with him and the boys to talk neighborhood gossip. The idea of spending the weekend away from home sounded fantastic, so I didn't tell Janet about my plans. It was a chilly Friday morning, and over breakfast I casually asked how I could get to Janet while she was away. She calmly rejected the idea, saying she would be with powerful people and didn't want to be interrupted. It felt like she saw me as an intrusive father rather than a husband. I let it go, and later that day, Janet left for Atlantic City. The meeting with Carmine was a real meeting. It's been over a year since we last hung out. I was one of the few who managed to leave the old district without being behind bars. Carmine also mentioned his debt, promising to help me if I needed it. On a Saturday night, we went to the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge in Southeast, a strip reminiscent of Beta Bing from The Sopranos. The place was filled with scantily clad dancers, just like in the show. A young woman who looked not much older than 18 came up and danced provocatively in front of me. Carmina mentioned that she was available for the night, emphasizing that she could be mine if I wanted. At the same time, he made inappropriate physical contact. In response, I expressed my commitment to the marriage vows, acknowledging my temptation, but affirming that loyalty and faithfulness mattered to me. I declined the advances of an attractive stripper, and she moved on to another interested male client. Carmine remarked in disbelief that I seemed to take fidelity very seriously. I confirmed my position by declaring that without fidelity, there would be nothing, no love, no marriage. The next morning brought typical Pittsburgh cold and windy weather, but that didn't stop hordes of fans from heading to Three Rivers Stadium for the Steelers versus Raiders game. The bitter rivalry between these two football teams bordered on gang warfare as the Steelers pulled victory from the jaws of defeat in one of the NFL's most memorable moments. Thanks to a lucky rebound from Franco Harris, he found himself on the end of an unlikely reception, changing the outcome of a fantastic defensive struggle against the Oakland Raiders in the first ever playoff game at Pittsburgh's Three Rivers Stadium. No team has forgotten that legacy. Good thing you can't use weapons on the playing field. The Steelers haven't had a great year at this point in the season with a 5-5 record. Today marks the biggest game of the season as the Silver and Black return to town. It was hard to headbang all day on the football field. I was hoarse from all the yelling and screaming, but the final score was Steelers 21, Raiders 20. The day could not have ended on a better note, or so I thought. Despite Carmine's invitation to celebrate, I had to bow and tell him another time. Tomorrow was going to be a tough day at the office, and I knew I didn't need a hangover on top of all the other work pressures. Also, Janet was coming home tonight, and I wanted to be there when she got home. However, Janet did not come home on Sunday night. I went to work on Monday morning with serious doubts about the latest developments in my marriage. Whenever I thought deeply about the state of Janet's relationship with me, there was a sense of impending doom. Of course, all marriages have had their rough moments, but perhaps ours has turned into something more than just a rough patch. The workday was as busy as expected when I left the house in the morning, with several high-level meetings and a lawsuit against the company high on my agenda. It wasn't until 5.30 that I had a chance to sit down and check my email. There were dozens of emails from employees with the latest information on the lawsuit. Near the end of the email list was one titled, "Who's the Last to Know?" When I opened the email anticipating a humorous cartoon, I was suddenly confronted with a photo of Janet and another man passionately embracing and kissing on the lips. Below the photo was a text message that simply offered, "Want to know what happened next? Click on the following link." A cold chill ran up my spine as I hesitated for a moment, looking at the photo of Janet kissing another man. I then clicked on the following link. Another photo flashed on the screen. This time, Janet and the man she was kissing were unclothed and standing together in a motel room. Again, at the bottom of the photo was a text message that simply said, "Want to know what happened next? Click on the following link." My hand was shaking. My throat and chest tightened as the unclothed image of my wife burned into my brain. There was a part of me that didn't want to see the next photo. Still, I knew I had to click on the link. The next photo was the end of my marriage, with Janet on the bed on all fours with the same man as in the other two photos, a look of lust and ecstasy on her face. The only woman I loved with all my heart turned out to be an unfaithful adulteress. I had given her all my love and trust, and now she was ripping my heart out of my chest. The text at the bottom of the photo read, "Courtesy of Robert Tolson." My worst nightmare was being shoved in my face. Janet's recent dream was undoubtedly the coldness, only by a wife who was upset with her husband. It felt like a cadaver kitten in our dying marriage. What happened next? Anger and anger. It was a calm decision for me, a feeling I haven't felt in a long time. Revenge stuck in my mind because infidelity and betrayal will not last in my life. Two people will pay dearly for knowingly insulting me. My initial thoughts revolved around the person sending the incriminating emails. There is no name or identification of the sender. There were questions in my head. Why send this email? What did they hope to gain by exposing my wife's infidelity? Were they friends or enemies of Janet? I would have to deal with these issues later. I inserted the CD into my computer, copied the letter and the 3 photos, and then deleted it. The cleanup program erased all evidence from my hard drive. Sitting in my swivel chair, making sense of Janet's betrayal, I could only relate it to her different personalities. However, if she wanted a divorce, I would grant it, and we could both walk away from this marital wreck. But now my revenge would be swift and complete. I would not spare any of them. The plan began to take shape in my head. After leaving the office, I found a payphone around the corner. After dialing my untraceable cell phone, I told Carmen that I thought it was time to collect the debt he owed me. When I got home around 7:30, I found Janet already there, watching TV. She took her time to greet me but commented on my lateness, saying that I was coming home late. In response, I noticed that she was also coming home late because I had gone to the kitchen. There was silence between us. I grabbed a beer and headed to my office, making sure to lock the door. In our country, a person convicted of a criminal offense usually receives one of two punishments, either imprisonment or life imprisonment. My revenge plan involved one fine and one life sentence. I needed some quiet time to complete my revenge plan. Carmen could handle Mr. Robert Tolson, and I would personally settle the score with Janet. To make the revenge look like a simple case of a wife leaving her husband, I sent flowers to Janet's office and ordered lunch near her workplace. I left messages for her to meet me, but she never showed up. I instructed the maitre d' to pass our table to someone else, making sure he remembered that my wife had picked me up. Janet returned home that evening without offering any explanation or reason why we'd not ordered dinner. The thing is, I didn't care about anything she had to say to the contrary. The bait was thrown, and the wheels of revenge were set in motion. The next day, a courier came to my office and handed me a stamped envelope personally and confidentially. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a bold heading ordering it to be destroyed after reading. The first sentence on the paper advised me to provide myself with an airtight alibi for the coming night. The second sentence gave Carlos Mandara's name and phone number. I read and reread the phone number until I remembered it. The paper was then sent through a shredder, and I collected the shredded pieces to discreetly dispose of them that evening in various trash cans outside the office building. I got home before Janet, changed, poured a tall Jim Beam, and sat down to some light jazz. The TV remained switched off. This was to be my night as king of my castle. Janet had to find entertainment for herself. When she returned home, there was no confrontation. She quickly assessed the scene and turned to head out the door again. I couldn't care less about her destination, eating or meeting Robert Tolson. The sand in the hourglass was almost empty for both of them. I was in bed when Janet finally returned, slipping quietly in beside me. Silence was the loudest noise before I fell asleep. Thursday night was a regular poker night for some guys from work, held in the back room of the old Stagecoach bar. This served as my airtight alibi for the rest of the evening. This time I went to bed early in the morning. The clock on my bedside table read 2:35 as I pulled the covers over me. Janet heard no sound or movement. It wasn't hard to fall asleep, even though I knew what had happened earlier in the evening. Now that Robert Tolson has been sentenced to death, it's time to punish the other criminal. No immediate action was required for the life sentence. Janet's punishment will begin after the phone call, providing a sense of satisfaction and justice. Whatever it was about Janet's warped personality that led her to blatantly disrespect me is for someone else to decide. I no longer felt compassion for the woman I once loved with all my heart and soul. The coming retribution was made by herself. The police interviewed every employee of the Calcas Realty Agency, collecting interesting but contradictory statements. Janet faced several interviews with the police. Detective Lawrence Becht asked me about Robert Tolson, trying to get me interested in questions about the more than professional relationship between Robert and Janet. I reaffirmed my complete faith in my wife's faithfulness, dismissing any doubts. He just smiled at me, perhaps pitying me as a poor, betrayed person. Robert Tolson's funeral was held on Tuesday. That morning I saw Janet in her somber black dress, the same one she had worn at my mother's funeral. She didn't ask if I wanted to accompany her to Robert's funeral. Whatever thoughts she had about Robert's death, she kept to herself. No doubt she had a lot to think about, including the murder and her infidelity. Over the next week, Janet seemed eager to discuss our relationship seriously. However, my cold shoulder instantly stopped her attempts. I'm beyond any possibility of reconciliation or atonement. I had the power to stop the charade if I wanted to. 3 weeks after Robert's murder, the police investigation appeared to have lost momentum. No new allegations have emerged, and there has been speculation that Robert may have been hit by a moneylender or bookie. During this period, Janet's mental state continued to deteriorate, marked by increasing absent-mindedness and confusion. Little things scared her, but I offered no help or comfort, even as I watched her struggle. I thought to myself, really bad, watching her slowly unravel. Finally, the following Thursday, I called Carlos. The plan had already been made, and he was very eager to put it into action. Janet had only a few hours left before her new life began. On Friday morning, I left for work before Janet got dressed, deliberately avoiding the last meeting at my house. The sand in the hourglass has run out. Across the road from our house was a car with two men. The abduction took place at a four-way intersection with stop signs, with vehicles in front and behind Janet's car blocking her escape. With the precision of a Delta Force team, the two men moved swiftly. When the driver's door opened, a needle pierced her arm, and her seatbelt was cut. Janet was placed in the passenger seat, and one of the men got into the driver's seat. The three cars quickly left, the whole process taking less than 30 seconds. There were no witnesses. At 11 o'clock that morning, a woman painted to look exactly like Janet walked into the bank's East Side branch and handed the teller a receipt for $25,000 from our joint account. She presented her driver's license and passport as proof of identity. It took the cashier a few minutes to process the withdrawal in the form of a cashier's check. The guard escorted the woman to her car, noting the license plate as she drove away. The line at the American Airlines counter was short. Doppelganger Janet walked up to the counter, presented her photo ID and passport, and received her boarding pass. Flight reservations were made online the night before. The first leg of the journey was at JFK, followed by non-stop flight #951 to Rio de Janeiro. Departure from Pittsburgh was at 4:45 p.m., arriving at JFK in New York. Later at 10:30 p.m., an American Airlines plane took off with passenger Janet Canello on an overnight flight to Brazil. I waited until noon on Saturday before contacting the police to report the person missing. Surprisingly, Detective Lawrence Becton was the officer who arrived at the home to file a report. I informed him that Janet had not returned home at her usual time. Attempts to reach her on her cell phone were futile, as it displayed a no-service notification. When I contacted Amanda Staccato, one of Janet's close friends at Calcas Realty, she said that Janet didn't show up for work the day before and didn't even call to report her absence. Detective Becton was making cryptic notes in his notebook, occasionally glancing at me. Eventually, he started asking about the state of my marriage, exploring potential problems that could be related to Janet's disappearance. I repeated what I told him after the investigation into Robert Tolson's murder. Our marriage was good, and I couldn't understand why Janet would voluntarily disappear. He then asked if I had engaged in any indecency with Janet, to which I emphatically declared my love for my wife and my inability to harm her. Lying to the police was a skill I developed at an early age dealing with the younger mob, and it continued to serve me well. 3 days later, Detective Becton visited my office during business hours, presumably to evaluate the husband he was dealing with. Once he was in my office, he sat down and gave a tight smile. I had a distressed look on my husband's face as I asked him about news of Janet's whereabouts. He responded by saying that they had resumed Janet's activity after she left my house on Friday morning, giving some information with a mix of positive and negative aspects. Several witnesses claimed to have seen her having coffee at the Denny's restaurant on Bennett Street around 10 a.m. Friday. Detective Becton told me that Janet showed up at the Allegheny National Bank around 11 o'clock, which was caught on surveillance video. She withdrew $25,000 from our joint savings account. When he shared this information, I expressed disbelief and asked how that was possible, stating that Janet had not mentioned anything about wanting to withdraw the money. Detective Becton assured me that the facts were clear, explaining that the cashier had made photocopies of Janet's driver's license and passport before issuing the cashier's check. He was sure that if I saw the CCTV tape, I would identify the person at the teller window as my wife Janet. Detective Becton paused again to gauge my reaction to his revelation. I told the detective that I thought there must be some mistake, emphasizing that Janet and I had discussed everything that was going on in our marriage. I kept a surprised look at the police detective, knowing he was saving the most devastating news for last, and I had to prepare for another acting gig. The detective went on to share the most disturbing news, saying that my wife had purchased plane tickets to New York and then to Rio de Janeiro. He mentioned that they found her car in long-term parking at the airport, revealing that her flight left Pittsburgh on Friday afternoon at 4:45 and her flight to Rio left New York at 10:30. The detective told me that they had contacted the Rio de Janeiro police to find Janet, but she seemed to have disappeared as soon as she arrived in Rio. Detective Becton was looking at me intently now, waiting for my answer. I exclaimed that this was madness and declared that Janet would never do such a thing. I emphasized my belief in her love for me and mine for her, expressing that leaving the country was absurd. In an attempt to portray a cheating husband, I started crying right in front of the detective. There was a moment of silence in my office before the detective continued. He asked if I thought it had anything to do with the Robert Tolson murder. In response, I asked how he could ask such a question. Insisting that my wife had nothing to do with the murder, I reminded him that she had been questioned and never charged in the matter. The detective clarified that they had never charged my wife, but she was high on the list of suspects. I responded to the detective's statement about other opinions that my wife and Mr. Tolson were in a romantic relationship. Expressing my disbelief, I stated that it was absurd to accuse her of involvement in Tolson's murder, stressing that it took more than office gossip to back up such a claim. My eyes bore into his as I challenged the credibility of the accusations. The detective explained that they were still investigating, and now that my wife was out of the country, suspicions about her role in the murder had increased. He paused for a moment and shared that evidence at the crime scene indicated a carnal motive, as Tolson was tortured and beaten for hours before he was strangled. I barely laughed in response, rejecting the idea that my little wife could have committed such a crime. I questioned the detective's faith in her abilities, stating that she could barely open a pickle jar, let alone choke someone. I expressed my disappointment at the escalation and the seemingly baseless accusations. I approached Detective Becton, acknowledging that all the evidence so far pointed to my wife's involvement, and he suggested that she might have received help. Surprised, I questioned the possibility of being this other person before he could say more. He explained that they were considering that possibility, but assured me that I had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. However, his voice lacked conviction. I summed up the situation by expressing disbelief that they believed my wife had left the country because of her involvement in the murder, and that I was probably suspected of helping her. Pausing to look at him, I asked for clarification, asking if I had summed up his statements accurately. He sat and assessed whether my indignation was sincere or not. With a hint of disdain in my voice, I informed the detective that, if nothing else, the meeting was over. Getting up from the table, I walked over to the closed door and opened it, signaling him to leave. Becton rose from his chair and walked slowly to the door. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Canello. I will keep you updated on your wife's disappearance." He did not extend his hand, and I did not give mine. After the detective left, I closed the door and settled back in my chair. I was convinced that Becton's visit was intended to elicit more information than to provide substantial details about the two cases. I carefully considered each statement and question, realizing that he suspected my involvement. However, my alibi was solid. I was playing poker the night Robert Tolson was executed, and I was in meetings all day Friday when Janet disappeared. It was Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Janet's disappearance. I haven't heard anything about Carlos or Carmina. Janet's whereabouts and well-being remained unknown. Sometimes I felt like I was being watched, the morning commutes and the evening commutes. My actions were carefully planned, from work to home with grocery shopping on the way. There is no sign of evasion or someone trying to hide. A day later, I called the department, Becton, for news of my missing wife, but he had no new information. Brazilian police found no evidence of Janet after her arrival in Rio. Later that day, I ordered a pizza from Domino's. While watching college football on TV, the doorbell rang and the pizza delivery boy arrived with my hot pizza. I paid him and offered a couple of bucks as a tip. Opening the pizza box in the kitchen, I noticed an envelope on top. Opening it, I pulled out a piece of paper with instructions for the next day. This ordered me to dress for church and attend the 10 o'clock Mass at St. Peter's Church. The note went on to instruct me to slip out the side door on the east side of the church during communion, where a dark Ford Crown Victoria would be waiting outside. As I held the sheet, I realized that this would be the last time I would see Janet before Carlos sent her out of the country. He waited 2 weeks to ensure that Janet's well-documented plan to fly out of the country against COVID was all the evidence the police had to work with. Carlos created an elaborate hoax to mislead the investigation by establishing that Janet was alive when she boarded the plane to Rio. This prevented the police from opening a circumstantial case against me, even though the body was not found. The bedroom was dark as I stared at the ceiling. The last month and a half have been a real nightmare for me after receiving this letter. The chain of events reminded me that my ancestral roots will always bring out the dark side of my personality. Whenever I was disrespected by someone, whether by nature or nurture, there was no doubt in my mind where my dark side came from. St. Peter's is a large church, and the Mass at 10 o'clock is attended by several hundred parishioners. It was easy to get lost in this crowd and notice if someone was following me. When the police were following me, they must have been waiting outside the church as the crowd of people moved towards the church for communion. I quickly slipped out the side door. A dark Ford sedan was waiting with the engine running, and I got into the back seat as the car roared into the busy street. The ride took about 10 minutes before the large sedan stopped in front of a large warehouse. The driver did not turn around, ordering me to enter the building through the side door. Inside the large empty building near the back was an office area with light coming in from several windows. As I approached, Carlos got out and walked over to me, marking our first face-to-face meeting. Carlos greeted me by mentioning that Carmine said you could call me JC. We shook hands, and Carlos, with a stoic expression on his face, warned me of Janet's change in condition, hinting that it might not be pleasant to see her. I said that I was no longer concerned with her appearance and what she had been through since she was taken, and walked to the open door. Stopping at the door, I asked if she was currently taking her medication. Carlos said no, but admitted that he probably wished she had. He claimed to have kept her clean and sane at all times, claiming that she was now a broken woman and well prepared for a new life. We both entered a well-lit room where Janet was tied to a chair in the center. I circled her, standing right in front of her. Although they were inches apart, she was silent, looking over my shoulder, her eyes missing the sparkle and vitality. I spoke to Janet, saying that for the rest of her life she would remember how she had caused her suffering. I told how I had put up with her mood swings and cold attitude, stressing that her infidelity and the disrespect she and her lover showed were intolerable. I argued that she would spend the rest of her life paying for her infidelity, mentioning that Robert had already paid his debt to me. Speaking slowly, I wanted her to understand that I was the one who held her and her lover accountable. Even though I once loved her, I transferred my current hatred towards her. I informed her that Carlos had assured me that she would take good care of where she was sent, as well as they take care of their best horses and cattle. I stood there for another minute, watching a tear form in Janet's eye. That was the only confirmation I got before turning and walking away. The Ford sedan took me back to St. Peter's, where I went inside. When the 11 o'clock Mass ended, I left the church and went straight home. The hard knot in my intestines had to be drowned with some sort of exercise beam. It's been 3 years since I last saw Janet. I almost completely forgot her, without a trace in my life. I sold the house we lived in after she disappeared. Dr. Becton's files are now sealed. I spend more time with Carmine in the sweet kitty cat lounge. I tried all the suggestions of this cute young stripper many times. Marriage is out of the question. My 5 years with Janet have convinced me that women are more trouble than they're worth when you marry them. My parents were right to regret my association with Janet. Children should listen to their parents' advice, however rarely. I later found out that the letter was sent to me by Amanda Staccato. This prevented the police from opening a circumstantial case against me, even though the body was not found. The bedroom was dark as I stared at the ceiling. The last month and a half have been a real nightmare for me after receiving this letter. The chain of events reminded me that my ancestral roots will always bring out the dark side of my personality. Whenever I was disrespected by someone, whether by nature or nurture, there was no doubt in my mind where my dark side came from. St. Peter's is a large church, and the Mass at 10 o'clock is attended by several hundred parishioners. It was easy to get lost in this crowd and notice if someone was following me. When the police were following me, they must have been waiting outside the church as the crowd of people moved toward the church for communion. I quickly slipped out the side door. A dark Ford sedan was waiting with the engine running, and I got into the back seat as the car roared into the busy street. The ride took about 10 minutes before the large sedan stopped in front of a large warehouse. The driver did not turn around, ordering me to enter the building through the side door. Inside the large empty building near the back was an office area with light coming in from several windows. As I approached, Carlos got out and walked over to me, marking our first face-to-face meeting. Carlos greeted me by mentioning that Carmine said you could call me JC. We shook hands and Carlos, with a stoic expression on his face, warned me of Janet's change in condition, hinting that it might not be pleasant to see her. I said that I was no longer concerned with her appearance and what she had been through since she was taken, and walked to the open door. Stopping at the door, I asked if she was currently taking her medication. Carlos said no, but admitted that he probably wished she had. He claimed to have kept her clean and sane at all times, claiming that she was now a broken woman and well prepared for a new life. We both entered a well-lit room where Janet was tied to a chair in the center. I circled her, standing right in front of her. Although they were inches apart, she was silent, looking over my shoulder, her eyes missing the sparkle and vitality. I spoke to Janet, saying that for the rest of her life, she would remember how she had caused her suffering. I told how I had put up with her mood swings and cold attitude, stressing that her infidelity and the disrespect she and her lover showed were intolerable. I argued that she would spend the rest of her life paying for her infidelity, mentioning that Robert had already paid his debt to me. Speaking slowly, I wanted her to understand that I was the one who held her and her lover accountable. Even though I once loved her, I transferred my current hatred towards her. I informed her that Carlos had assured me that she would take good care of where she was sent, as well as they take care of their best horses and cattle. I stood there for another minute, watching a tear form in Janet's eye. That was the only confirmation I got before turning and walking away. The Ford sedan took me back to St. Peter S, where I went inside. When the 11 o'clock mass ended, I left the church and went straight home. The hard knot in my intestines had to be drowned with some sort of exercise beam. It's been 3 years since I last saw Janet. I almost completely forgot her, without a trace in my life. I sold the house we lived in after she disappeared. Dr. Becton's files are now sealed. I spend more time with Carmine in the sweet kitty cat lounge. I tried all the suggestions of this cute young stripper many times. Marriage is out of the question. My 5 years with Janet have convinced me that women are more trouble than they're worth when you marry them. My parents were right to regret my association with Janet. Children should listen to their parents' advice, however rarely. I later found out that the letter was sent to me by Amanda Staccato. She was Robert Tolson's lover before he dumped her for Janet. I never thanked her for the letter. I also didn't find out how she got those photos of Robert and Janet. I think she took her revenge when I did. It says something about the wrath of a woman scorned.